Coupling and cohesion has been a thing since time immemorial in software development. If we're building bigger systems or writing infrastructure as code now, let's not make mistakes, right? That we've already done, like in the software engineering world. Let's bring this in to the platform engineering.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 273, Adapting Three-Tier Architecture for Platform Engineering. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. Victor, back in the day, you were a Java developer, weren't you?
I was, and I'm not ashamed of it.
Now, that was back in the day. You have since moved on, and now you are ashamed of it.
No, it's, there are many things I did when I was young, and I'm not ashamed of any of those, including Java, right? I did much worse things than Java back in the day.
What would that have been?
You said no swearing, Darin, in this podcast, so I cannot answer that question.
Okay, fair enough. I've also been an old crusty Java developer for years as well. One thing that both you and I learned in this, good, bad, or indifferent, was three-tier applications.
That's not even specific to Java. I think that's specific to any developer who spent more than a month learning how to develop in any language, except Perl.
Except Perl, because everything was just, here's the file, go run it.
Exactly.
On today's show, we have Daniel Bryant on. Daniel, how are you doing?
Yeah, very good, Darren. Thanks for the invite.
Three-tier applications. Why are we talking about something that was brand new 25 plus years ago, it feels like, and why it's even important in today's world?
Yeah, so like both of you, I'm a recovering Java developer, and I very much started my career with that, right? And built many applications with Java EE, now Jakarta EE, and Spring and a bunch of other frameworks. And we always had those three tiers. Broadly speaking, UI, services, database, repository at the back end kind of thing. And I believe that's something we should be bringing in as a mental model for platforms. Like I know, Victor, you've got many talks online, but talking about the UI of platforms, how we interact with platforms. There's obviously that bottom layer, sort of the infrastructure layer, if you like. And the way I'm looking at the moment is there's this middle tier that's often missing around platform orchestration. So you have kind of the UI, the platform orchestration, and then the infrastructure management at the bottom. And I think bringing our old Java mental model of the three-tier architecture to platform engineering, we can prevent some of the wheel reinvention we might otherwise see. Learn from the old days, bring it across the new. What's old is new, right? We're going to make new mistakes in this space for sure, but I'm keen to avoid making similar mistakes we perhaps did back in the Java days or other service-oriented architectures, those kind of things. Bring some of those learnings into platforms. That's my pitch.
What were some of the mistakes that we did make?
Very early on, I think there was a real smushing up of code. Sort of this, it was very much violating the single responsibility principle. I wrote my fair share of Perl, CGI back in the day, as we both we all hinted at, right? And with Perl, for example, you did typically mash up all the functionality into one file, and that it's very quick to get going, right? I can write my sort of event handling logic, I can write my business logic, and I can write some database manipulation logic all in one file, ship it, we're good to go. The challenge I definitely saw in the more enterprise Java space was maintaining that. If you wrote everything in one file, one Java class file, there was no cohesion and it was very coupled. And as architects of anything, right? Architects of software, architects of platforms, you always want to strive for that low coupling and high cohesion. It's just easier to understand, easier to maintain. So that's why I'm definitely advocating taking, those mistakes we made in the early Java days, in the Perl days. We mushed everything together, separate it all out, single responsibility, very easy to understand and maintain the code, the platforms going forward.
I feel that big part of that problem is that every once in a while we have a new area of industry that jumps into software development and starts making the same mistakes that other areas did before, right? I saw the same mistakes, for example, with ML back in the day, right? When data scientists jumped into software development because, heck, now we need to also write some code and so on and so forth. And we had those same discussions, right? Yeah, this is nice, right? I understand how this is great that you write in Python everything as a single script. But by the way, we spent 30 years not doing that, right? And I feel that this is something what is happening to recovered ops people or sysadmins and so on and so forth, right? We're building platforms and we are not yet up to date with all the know-how that end user developers did in the past. Does that make sense somehow?
100%. And I think, I've been lucky enough in my career to do all the things. I've racked and stacked hardware. I've written my fair share of Ansible, Terraform, of Crossplane, right? So I bring my software engineering knowledge and mistakes into those projects. Where I really learn from the ops folks as sysadmins is a more deeper sort of mechanical sympathy, understanding of the actual tech. So I'm definitely saying there's benefits for both of us here, right? In terms of if you're an ops person, you're probably going to understand, like say, the infrastructure and the config to a much deeper level, which I don't. But to your point, I can share, hey, coupling and cohesion has been a thing since time immemorial in software development. We should bring this in. If we're building bigger systems or writing infrastructure as code now, to your point, Victor, let's not make mistakes, right, that we've already done, like in the software engineering world. Let's bring this in to the platform engineering, the DevOps world.
How can we even do that today? People still take whatever the tool of the day is, try to stuff everything into that one tool, and make it work. In fact, Victor recently, a couple of months ago, had a video about Terraform and Ansible, and what was the third one, Victor?
Not a couple of months ago, yesterday. Darren, you're being so old. I mean, I understand that you cannot remember last week, but yesterday? Come on. Oh, now I'm remembering that this podcast airs months from now. Now I'm the silly one. Okay.
So anyway, what was the third one?
Ansible, Terraform, and Crossplane as examples. But I feel there is some relation between what Brian is talking and that, but I feel it's more like, I don't think that it matters which objective you're trying to fulfill when you're talking about architecture. I think that that's the key over there, right? The fact that we are building services for a platform should not be conceptually different than building services for people who want to shop something online. Essentially, it's the same thing, right? You go to Amazon, you have a front end, you have a back end, you have a database, and you see only the front end or whichever interface is given to you, right? Doesn't matter whether we're talking about launching satellites into space, whether we're talking about shopping, or we're talking about platforms. The logic of how you architecture something is the same. Not necessarily technology, but the logic.
100% agree. And to your point, Darren, I think it often starts with, we find a really good tool, and I'll just pick Terraform. I wrote a whole bunch of Terraform back in the day, right? And then I tried to shoehorn some of my knowledge and experience into Terraform, and the tool wasn't quite built for that. Like modules weren't really a thing when I started writing lots of Terraform, right? And then when modules became a thing, you could do like boundaries and somewhat APIs as an example within these things, and suddenly I was like, happy days. Now we've got modular, composable scripts, or composable code. Great stuff. I think the industry and the tools have to mature to a certain point. To Victor's point, we're all writing infrastructure as code. Now the tools pretty much support some of these classic software architecture, software design principles. And then really, to your point, Darren, it's an education piece. It's folks like us that have made the mistakes back in the day with Java, .NET, pick your poison, and trying to spread some of that knowledge through conference talks, through podcasts, right, through blogs about, hey, we made all these mistakes back in the day, like learn from our mistakes, make new ones. I think it's a big time education piece without sounding too preachy, because it's very tempting to go, you must build your code like this, you must do this, and then you just get pushed back, right? You've got to talk about the pain points, the maintainability, the composability, these things, and then say, hey, with those pain points in mind, here's the benefits of writing, with clear APIs, with well-defined boundaries, even bringing into your point, Victor, like domain-driven design principles pretty much are good, whether you're writing software for an e-commerce site or you're writing, X as a service for your platform. I think that's a really nice sort of phrasing you had there.
The problem with everything you just said, Daniel, is that this is a repeating story with every generation. I used to be the 20-year-old saying these 50 and 60-year-olds don't know what they're talking about.
Same. Yeah.
I know all the new tech. They don't.
Yeah.
And now I am that 50 and 60-year-old person trying to say, please, please, please don't do this. We did this years ago, a few times over the years. Let's not do it again. But yet, we still persist in doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result.
I would make a slight correction to what you said. I don't think the problem is with new generations, but rather with new segments or industry groups or whatever you want to call it. Because a new generation of developers, when they just finish university and they're plugged into a team that is working on that e-commerce site, whether they want it or not, they will be plugged into machinery and figure those things out, right? Maybe not the first day, but eventually, because they're part of the team that already established that as best practice. That team has some other problems. So let's make it clear. It's not that they're problemless. That's why I mentioned machine learning. We never did this before, right? We're a completely different team that is not plugged into other teams' machinery. And then we see those problems. So it's not necessarily generation, but rather teams that had to switch to, let's put it this way, maybe had to start writing more code than before.
Yeah, I'd agree on that one, Victor. I think there's definitely an element of what you said, Darren, as well. Like we are sort of doomed to repeat our mistakes. The history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. I think there is an element of that. But I do think, to what you're saying, Victor, the biggest point, I saw the machine learning thing when I was working at Ambassador Labs. Some really smart folks are writing amazing ETL and ELT kind of conversion code, but not even putting comments in it was a classic, right? And I was like, how am I going to understand? You've got no comments in there, what you're actually doing. And then once you've got comments in, we're like, hey, now start pulling these things apart, make it composable, make it understandable, make it maintainable. And I was literally teaching these very smart folks who are data scientists and machine learning specialists about software engineering 101. And I totally find myself doing that now with ops and sysadmin folks, right? Saying, hey, there's these, single responsibility principle, loosely coupled, high cohesion. I think there's a bit of both there, but I agree with you, like Victor, the strongest challenge is with really smart folks coming from a segment that have not been exposed to coding, software design principles, and suddenly then like coming into writing everything as code. Like they know what they're doing, but I think they can benefit from learning from us who've been more software engineering sort of background or have more of a software engineering background.
To be clear, just not to sound like I'm trashing one group over the other groups can learn a lot from those as well, right?
Yes, 100%.
We had no idea how to manage data, right, in the past.
Yeah.
Java developers, right? Just as many developers today don't understand almost anything about infrastructure. So it's not kind of, hey, you don't know what you're doing and we know. It's just that you know how to do this thing and we know how to do that thing. How about maybe actually we exchange notes? We go on a date, for example, maybe. Right?
100%. Like I have learned so much from very generous ops people over the years, like about databases, about networking, and that was what they taught me. I taught them more software engineering principles, but I learned a ton about how network packets traverse, various networks and DNS. Like everyone loves DNS, right? I learned a bunch from those folks. So that's why I'm 100% supporting what you're saying there. Is finding out that sort of Venn diagram, that sort of that gap in the either side where we can teach each other different things, right? Valuable skills.
So what do we have to do today? If we're trying to help, okay, we're the old crusty people. How do we help guide people in the way that they should be doing things? Again, you laid it out, and correct me if the statements are incorrect, but UI, the new middle layer, at least in this world, is platform orchestration. And then the third layer, the bottom layer, is the actual infrastructure itself. Where do we start in that stack? Because if people have already been using, let's use Terraform for a moment. And I have to go back for the Terraform thing, and this goes either way. Once that module for ordering a Domino's pizza showed up, I think that made people think, oh, I can do anything with Terraform. Right? Because if I can order a pizza using Terraform, then I should be able to use it for everything. But just because you can use a tool to do something doesn't mean you should.
Yeah, very
Is that
well
where
said.
we start? Is trying to figure out where a tool really should be used?
I think that's perfectly said. And yes, and I think there's going to be some strong opinions on this, and I don't think there is a 100% correct answer. I think, some folks are going to say, hey, with the infrastructure layer, you can do a bunch of platform orchestration. And I think some folks from the UI or the portal layer are going to say, hey, I can do orchestration at this layer. And I think they're all right. Do you know what I mean? I think what I'm here to really sort of espouse is just thinking about the different responsibilities at each layer. And if you spot signs that, hey, my portal is becoming really bloated with like logic, that's pretty much signs I saw back in the day when I was writing JSP pages, right? Suddenly everyone was putting logic in these HTML JSP pages, and they were crazy hard to maintain, like really hard to understand at times. And I'm wondering if we might see the same thing with the portals. And and just to keep it fair, like Victor was doing, I wrote my fair share of horrible database triggers back in the day, right? I didn't fully understand databases. I chucked some logic in there, PLSQL, some triggers, and that logic, with hindsight, should have definitely been pulled up to the back end Java layer, right? But I just saw, I had the hammer and everything looked like a nail, and I was just I learned PLSQL, so I was keen to use my skills, and so I bolted all this logic into the database. So I think it's educating folks on where certain responsibilities, certain affordances fit within that three-level model, that three-layer model. And just to be, again, honest, like no model is correct. Some are useful, right? I think that's every model is wrong. Some are useful. I just find that 3 layers really good for thinking exercise in terms of if I'm struggling at one of the layers, maybe it's because I'm doing the wrong thing or too much in that layer. And can I find another tool, or can I use the existing tool with different practices to make my life and my team's life better?
So let's go back to my original question. Where do we start today? What is it just peeling off, finding out that right? Because to me, again, I'm also an old database person. Store procedures were the bomb years and years and years and years ago. But the problem is they were also the bomb minutes ago, depending on which company I'm in. Is that really where it's at? Is you've got to get the lay of the land. Let's say you have recently moved into a new company, right? This is you technically, but anybody else. You moved into a new company as an admin, maybe a database admin, and you've been a database admin for the past 20 years. So therefore, everything you're going to try to solve is going to be store procedures because that's what you know. But you're coming into a new organization that has said and mandated no store procedures. What are you going to do?
That's a great question. It's really hard, right? I mean, depending on your sort of the level you being brought in, if you're an individual contributor versus say like a staff plus or a manager, like if you've got more pull, you can try and educate the team, the organization, to what you think is correct, right? In terms of, hey, actually, there's a lot of value in store procedures. Here's why I think that. If you haven't got that pull, you kind of have to earn it, right? You have to go along with what they want, but then point out some of the challenges along the way. Maybe even run some little side hustles where you're trying out new things and demonstrating the value there. I always say you have to meet folks where they're at, meet people where they're at before you can start making changes. If you try and run roughshod over things, it's very hard. Even with, if you've got sort of authority on your side, it's very hard. But I think, it does depend on where you're coming into the organization and what pull you've got initially.
Okay, now we're coming into real world. Portal versus platform. You're the new person coming in from outside. You've done both portal and platform. By the way, there is a difference. And you come into a new organization and they're still store procedures, point and click UIs. They're just now starting to think about possibly using CF Engine. What do we do in that case?
that is a great line of technology there, Darren. I love it. I haven't used CF Engine for years.
If they're thinking about using CF Engine, the correct course of action is you turn 180 degrees and run and never look back. That's the correct answer. Whatever Daniel is going to tell you now is not right. This is the right answer.
Yeah, I support that, Victor, to be fair. But one, the sort of more like, with my sort of consulting type hat on, or my professional service hat on, you always look for the pain points, right, and work from there. And like, if where the blockers are, theory of constraints, call it what you will, all the good stuff from DevOps. And then you can start educating folks. Hey, our blockers here in deployments, we need to improve this. Hey, our blockers here in terms of maintainability, we need to think about this. But I do agree, Victor. Like, if I saw that tech stack, I'm just not built for that anymore. I would run away, right? I was like, a little bit of Terraform in there, maybe some crossplane. Right? As in, like, if it's CF Engine, oh man, that'd be a struggle.
Okay, that was an extreme example, but these kinds of places still exist today.
Oh, true. Yeah.
So if we're trying to help modernize, like at least bringing it into the last decade, what do we do? Like, how do we help train people or retrain people, I guess, retrain their minds to think that we sort of danced around this. We had the 3-tier architecture that we talked about. We've talked about DevOps, not the big, it's sort of like big A Agile and little a Agile. There is a big D, big O DevOps, but there's also a lowercase DevOps. We're not talking about the big D, big O. We're talking about the lowercase DevOps. And that's where people get confused. Is it really that simple, maybe, as I'm talking through this? People believe the marketing hype instead of the actual day-to-day operations?
From my perspective, there's a lot of companies, like particularly banks I'm working with, that are working, with very old technology, money-making technology, might I add, right? Business critical technology. And some of those folks aren't paying attention to the latest hypes going on. So, like, that's an easier job to work with those folks, because they're like, hey, what is the best practice now? And some of the folks that do go to conferences do hear all the latest kind of hype and buzz, and I'm not sure I've played my part in that over the years of contributing some of these things. And if they're really dialed into, I must use, I remember sort of a few years ago, everyone was like, I must use Docker. And again, to be clear, I love Docker, right? Love containers, but even I went a bit sort of Docker. Everyone was using Docker, right? And then you really got to start dialing into, again, what are the pain points? What are the problems you're trying to solve? That, I think, is core, almost like whether it's software engineering, whether it's platform engineering. You've really got to understand when there's an initiative going on, some manager has said, hey, we're going to be DevOps now. Hey, we're going to do platform engineering. Hey, we're going to run on Kubernetes. Again, when I was a consultant, I used to do the 5 whys, like try not to be aggressive with it, but understand what's the motivation. We're trying to move off of Puppet. And I'm like, why are you moving off Puppet? Oh, the developers don't like writing Puppet. And I'm like, so that's the real problem here, right? It's not that Puppet's bad. Puppet's great. But like, your developers didn't want to learn a new tool, didn't want to build a mental model around infrastructure. Can we put some facade, some kind of shim on top of that to make it easy for developers to work with that tool, but not be exposed to all the intricacies?
Part of pain points to me is very interesting, because pain points very often depend on the point of reference. I could say that, hey, my pain point is that it takes 5 days to get a database because I know that Daniel is getting it in a day, right? That's an obvious pain point. Or you can say, hey, actually, from our internal experience, it takes a month to get a database. So 5 days is definitely not a pain point, right? People very often compare themselves internally rather than externally. So I don't know really what is happening outside those 4 walls. So my pain points are relative to what my experience is. I see that as a very common disconnect with the rest of the world, right? We don't really know. Banks are a good example that you mentioned before, right? If we compare ourselves with other banks, we don't have many pain points.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But if we compare ourselves with Tesla, or if we compare ourselves with Google, or if we compare ourselves with, oh, look at that, there's a new fintech popping up every day.
Yeah.
And those fintechs are threatening our businesses. Now, our pain points change overnight, right?
Because really good point.
They're all of a sudden not the same.
Yeah, I see this, Victor, like folks like Starling Bank, Monzo, Revolut, as they've gotten more traction. I think it was a temptation for the traditional banks to be like, they'll take a little bit of market share, no worries, right? And now suddenly they're offering amazing UX, they're offering really good, rates, and the big banks, to your point, the pain points have switched overnight. Now we need a good mobile app. Now we need an API, open banking, PSD2. We need to support that stuff, right? Not only is it regulation, it's now a competitive advantage potentially. So I 100% agree with you. Like, it's all relative. And it's constantly shifting as well, right? And this is the challenge we as software engineers, platform engineers have. Like, you've got to be constantly vigilant as to what your top priority thing is. And if you've engaged in a 5-year modernization program, that's like turning a tanker ship, right? And suddenly something else pops up, a new fintech pops up. How are you going to turn your tanker ship to suddenly address Monzo snapping at your heels, right? And stealing all your market share? It's really hard. Don't get me wrong. I do not envy the CTOs of banks in any way, but you got to be looking at this stuff all the time.
Imagine engaging, and I've heard that sentence before, 5 years plan to counter the current threat.
Yeah,
that's happening with car industry right now. In 5 years, we're going to have software as good as Tesla today. Man, there's something wrong with you. You don't have 5 years. It's happening right now.
Yeah.
Because you were 5 years asleep, to be clear, right?
Yeah, it's tempting when you're like, the money's raking in, everyone's comfortable, everyone's getting their bonus based on old incentives. Again, I've lived this, I've seen some of this. It's really hard to change behavior. That's why it's a people problem, a process problem, more than a tech problem most of the time. But we're all at the sharp end of the tech, right? We've got to listen to what's going on from the C-level. We've got to look at the market, look at the positions, see where the market's going, and not, to your point, like the phrase, like the American phrase, but like with ice hockey, like skating to where the puck's going, right? Not skating to where the puck is now, because when you get there skating, puck's gone, right? Puck's in the goal or whatever. Like, you got to figure out where's that puck going, skate towards the puck.
Yes, that 5-year modernization program. I actually, when you said it, I sort of tweaked for just a second. I was like, okay.
Did you have a flashback?
Yeah, I won't say what it was, but yes, it was not a very pleasant experience. So we're going in. Let's say, okay, we've gone the extreme, even though it's not extreme in reality, but we've gone the extreme. What if somebody thinks they're doing it right, but you, as a consultant, even though it's not your day, but you've played this, I've played this, you go in, it's like, okay, you think you're doing it right? It's one thing when people ask you, okay, what's the new thing, right? Because then they're mentally already thinking, okay, we know we're behind. But what happens when you go to somebody and they think they're doing it right? What do we need to say to them?
That's a great question, actually. And I've lived some of this as a consultant. To keep coming back and banging the drum, like looking at the pain points, is what they're doing aligned with fixing the pain points? I've had those kind of conversations before where people are investing a lot in a platform. I did a whole bunch of work with Mesos and Kubernetes back in the day, right? And the constraint in their system was nothing to do with the platform. And when I started saying, hey, you've got this big modernization program focused on platforms, but actually the developers are all telling me like the CI/CD is the broken part here. Perhaps we should focus on CI/CD first. Like, if you can lay out some of the anecdotal stories combined with some data there, it's usually easier to change folks' mind rather than just coming in and going, hey, you're wrong. Clearly, you should not be moving on to Kubernetes. You should be just, using a basic VMs as building blocks, right? You're going to get instant pushback. You have to tell the story and you have to relate it to the current pain points within the organization.
Curious thing about consulting is that, at least in my experience, I would like to hear what's yours. For some reason, consultants have more credibility than internal people, even though they might be saying the same thing. I've been in situations where we speak, we discuss something, and I say, you should do this. And then afterwards, let's say, go for drinks, the guy from a company comes and says, man, I've been saying that for years now. Totally. And then they ignore me. But now you come from outside and say the same thing that I've been saying, and they say, okay, so maybe we should actually do that. I don't know whether that's only specific to me or that happened to others, but as if, okay, we don't trust anybody internally in a way, we're going to ignore you in a way until we pay somebody to say the same thing.
That is the key, Victor. Again, my experience in the US, like we say, fly-in expertise. If you've flown in the expertise, i.e. they're expensive, right? Like, then you listen to them more closely, right? And it is what it is. And when I was working as a consultant in London with Open Credo, we even used it to our advantage, not in a nefarious way, but just the ability to get stakeholders all together in one room and have a conversation used to be a massive unlock. As silly as that sounds, but because they were paying a lot of money for consultants, they were happy to get together in the same room, listen. And more often than not, to your point, one of our sort of go-to strategies was to chat to the engineers, the folks actually doing the work, and listening to their pain points, listening to their recommendations, and even saying, hey, I'm going to say it, I'm going to try not to steal your thunder, but I think what you're saying is right. If I can channel it through, you'll still get your way, so to speak, right? You got to manage the person there a little bit in terms of, because some folks are like, hey, you're stealing my idea as a consultant. And I was like, I'm not stealing your idea. I agree with what you're saying, but like if it comes from me as a flown-in expert, it's probably going to land better, right? And again, sometimes that's hard for like from an ego perspective for some folks to deal with. But yeah, it totally worked. I literally saw it, and I've heard way too many stories from ThoughtWorks buddies and other buddies in the space. Once you're flown in, once you're an expensive consultant, you can make stuff happen that much easier. Sucks, right? But it is what it is.
Should companies be doing portals and platforms today? Here we are, middle of 2024. People are arguing, do we even need it? Do they need it?
Great question, Darren. I mean, like if you look at the Gartner stats, they're saying like 80% of folks are going to be having a platform initiative, I think, by next year or the year after. So the train has left the station, I think, to some degree on that one. But I do think, can you ship software fast? Can you do it in a secure, robust way? And can you do it at scale? Those are the sort of three questions I constantly ask myself and folks I'm working with as well. And if you are struggling on any of those kind of three metrics, and you can look at Dora, you can look at Space, other metrics frameworks too, but if you're not hitting sort of targets you want, then I think the platform is a good place to look to start, right? And again, definitely do your homework. It may be the case that the software engineering is like department struggling, CI/CD is not working. Maybe the platform you've got is 30 years old, mainframe, right? Maybe you do need to like do some modernization there. I don't know, but I think it's key to look at the whole process there.
Well, I was waiting for you to say pain points again, because I thought you were going to lead with it again, because you've been very consistent. I'm going to argue that a lot of places may not need, no matter what Gartner says. Sorry, people at Gartner. They may not need it because that's not their real problem. They think it is because they're going to throw money at, hey, this portal will solve our problem. This platform will solve our problem. And again, it'll be another 5-year modernization effort. So by the time they get 5 years on, they're probably going to be in even worse shape than they are today, because now they've added on one more tool that they haven't kept updated. One more tool that the whole team has churned around it 5 times in that 5 years. So do people understand what they're getting into when they commit to a portal and a platform?
It's a great question. Yeah, I did want to lead with the pain points again because I probably sound like a broken record. All really good points you made there, Darren. I definitely always look at like sort of, theory constraints. What's your biggest blocker? But I also, part of me does think that the platform is, if you're shipping software, you have a platform, whether you know it or not, right? Like you have a software architecture, whether you know it or not. And looking at the big picture things like your architecture, like the platform itself and the architecture of your processes, which again, DevOps has influenced a lot there. Those are good places to start to look for the pain, look for potential solutions. And long as you're fixing pain points, the other thing I'd say was do it incrementally, right? To your point, like for me, like in this day and age and with all the fantastic resources that are out on the interwebs, like everything is screaming, do not do multi-year migrations. Or if you do have to do multi-year migrations because of all the tech and people involved, break it down, make it incremental, deliver value along the way, thinnest viable platform, proof of values, proof of concepts, ship small chunks, deliver value, get feedback. And so I think like that for me is something I think about. I'm always addressing the pain, but I do think looking at these big high leverage points like platforms, architecture, and processes can add real value if you find the pain and fix it incrementally.
In other words, everybody has a platform, whether they know it or not, right?
Yeah.
When you publish DevOps Paradox site, you have a platform, whether you call it like that or no. The question is whether you need to change it or keep it as is or throw it to trash and start over. That will greatly depend. I'm going to now amplify broken record on your pain points, right?
But nice.
More important, to me, the more important question is not that much whether you need the platform or not, because you do. You already have it. The question is more whether you should build it or buy it. And in my experience, the answer to that question largely depends on size. When I see a company that is relatively small, let's say 20, 30 developers, right? And they use, either Crossplane or Terraform or Kratix or any of those tools, I want to freak out. It's kind of, no. You just go to Netlify. You just go to Google Cloud Run. One of those, click a button, that's it. Don't spend months building something for 20 of you. Don't put 5 people to solve a problem of 10, right? But as your complexity and your size increases, then the story changes drastically, right? Like Heroku is a great tool that fails miserably at scale, as an example, right? Not because it's a bad tool, just it's designed to work really, really, really well. And there is no reason to change it until certain size, right? Certain complexity.
Very well said, Victor. I think something I bump into very much my day-to-day job. It is educating folks around, like, I think many of us, I used Heroku back in the day. I used Cloud Foundry. They're really good, like, and even like App Engine, like doing so many amazing things with Java and Google App Engine, right? And now we've got FAS, Amazon Lambda, Azure Functions. Take your pick. I do hear on that, in that a big part of, I think, the role I'm doing at the moment is educating folks about, if you've got thousands of developers, like some of the banks I'm working with, if you've got global presence and you want to standardize on some of these things, and you've got a big enough sort of footprint, then you're going to inevitably be building some part of that platform. Is how much do you want to build versus how much do you want to buy? Does that make sense? I think small companies, to your point, just kind of buy it, right? Rock on. When you're like mid-market, it's a bit more challenging, and you can buy it, maybe bolt some stuff on and customize it. But then when you get to enterprise scale, you're going to be building it. But I did a post on LinkedIn a few months ago now, I guess, where I talked about build versus buy versus blend. And I think a lot of the enterprises are blending stuff, right? They have anchored on Kratix, they have anchored on Crossplane or whatever, but they're blending it with some harness in the mix, some like Datadog in the mix, other things, right? And that then, like, managing all those things and delivering a sensible, consistent solution at scale is like where your time and energy is going to be spent.
It's interesting that you use the word anchored. I was thinking, as you were talking, about people trying to solve for long-term problems versus solving for now-term problems. Not short-term, because when you compare short and long, it feels like you're giving up, basically, when you're making that trade-off. But in reality, it doesn't really have to be that way. What is the next right step to deal with my pain for today that then I can get to tomorrow, that I take a look again at the pain? Whereas, let's use a physical example. You go to the doctor with 2 broken legs. You're probably not going to be walking out that same day. Not in 2024, at least. The AI overlords will take care of that in the future. If we apply that same mentality of, okay, look, I've got to get to the hospital. Okay, that's the first step. We're at the hospital. We're trying to figure out the pain points. I got 2 broken legs. Okay, am I going to surgery? Or do I need to wait for the swelling to go down before I go to surgery? My inner voice is yelling, go to surgery now. But by having somebody look at it, it's like, no, you really need to wait for probably about 2 days for all that swelling to go down before we go into surgery. We want to rush to the final, but in reality, we can't. How do we help people think through that process?
I feel that the problem is that very often companies will do one or the other, not both. So you will either do something that you can do this week while forgetting where you need to be in those 5 years that Daniel mentioned before, or you're going to plan 5 years and start going towards 5 years while forgetting what you can do this week, right? The challenge is how to find that balance, how to do what makes sense this week, this sprint, while still going into relatively correct direction, right? And that's where they fail. It's one or the other. Okay, let's find a cure for swelling, right? Or let's go to surgery. While what you should be doing is that, okay, long-term goal, Darin, you need to get that operated, right? We know what the long-term goal is now. Let's figure out what we can do to make you leave this office right now.
Yeah, big plus one, Victor. I think it also depends on your goals and your resources as well. Do you like to sort of manipulate your analogy a little bit, Darren? I'm a big Formula One fan. I think it was last season, Lance Stroll, driver for Aston Martin, rolled up and he broke both his wrists on a freak mountain biking accident the week before the season was going to start. And he went into like immediate surgery, had titanium rods placed in, and kind of was immediately doing crazy hard and very painful physio because he wanted to drive a race car really quickly. And let's be honest, he's probably not short of a few quid, right? A few dollars. Like, he probably paid top money to, get all the specialists flown in, give him a bunch of opinions. One said we can put titanium rods in. He's like, I need to be ready next week. make it happen, right? Whereas if that happened to like someone with not so many means at their availability, and not so many, they weren't driving a race car and they didn't want to worry about losing their career, they might have taken a more gentler approach there. Does that make sense? I think it did a big plus one to everything you said, Victor. But I think it also depends on your goals and resources. And someone like Lance Stroll had a lot of resources, and his goals were, I don't want to lose my career. I need to get in that race car next week. And he went through crazy pain and whatever that a bunch of us probably would not have tolerated, right?
I was hoping you weren't going to use the G word, but I was trying to stay away from goals and KPIs and everything else because you get into a dangerous spot when you start going down that path. Because just like Victor said, it's one or the other. When you start going down and adding in, okay, how does this align with where our goals now? Well, right now, what we're doing doesn't align with the goal, but it will get us to the point to where we can actually start heading back towards that goal. I mean, you could argue, yeah, that's part of the way of the goal, but people don't see it that way. We've talked about data scientists helping them get to the 3-tier process. Whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent, the 3-tier processes. Who is the next group of people in an organization that we're going to have to teach the 3-tier process to?
I think it is the platform engineers, Dan, right? I think it's the infrastructure folks. There's a bunch of folks out there that have been exposed to this, either like myself and probably many of us on this call, like they sort of have software development backgrounds and are bringing things in, or they're seeing it, in conference talks or whatever. But I think it is the platform engineers. Like to Victor's point, platforms, everyone's got a platform, whether you know it or not. It has such an influence on the way you design, ship, and run software that I just think it's the next point where everyone's going to be spending a lot of time and money and attention, right? Like, AI and data science is still going on there as well, but building these platforms to support that, as well as the kind of systems of engagement, like the actual web apps and all these other things going on. I just think the platform engineers are going to benefit a lot from learning about these 3 tiers and learning about software design and architecture principles.
5 years from now, we will be talking about all this in the area of AI. I guarantee that. We're going to see such a mess happening over there. You won't believe it. We're going to have platforms for AI. I guarantee that 100%.
We're probably already starting to see it now. I want to go back to what you were saying, Daniel. Isn't it too late for the people working in platforms today to be learning? I mean, it's not too late. But a lot of places have already started down their 5-year modernization with a new platform. And they're just shoehorning in what the vendor has sold them with disregard to the 3 tiers. Honestly, this is the first time I've heard anybody talk about the 3-tier idea. Makes sense to me because, well, that's just how we do things. And I had forgotten about, oh yeah, not everybody has gone through the pain and suffering of 3-tier design.
Yeah, I'm ever the optimist, right? Never too late. But I think even if you are forced to use a tool, and I've been that when I was a very early on Java developer, like I was like, my team was, you must make this enterprise service bus work, and they bought it on a golf course. It was all like top-down mandate, right? And I had to plug this thing in. But you can still apply good design principles. So we did take some time to write some adapters, facades, like kind of classic design patterns, to limit our exposure to some of the more gnarly things of that ESB. We definitely took time to understand that tool and how to work with it, but we did identify a few areas of friction, which we were like, we're going to do a lot of very custom work that if we change this thing or it breaks or doesn't perform as expected, it's going to be really hard for us to make modifications. So we did put those shims, adapters, facades in there. And I think you can still do the same today, Darren. If you take time, hopefully folks listening to this podcast are deliberately engaged in their learning journey, take time to educate yourself about the 3-tier systems of yore. And I've written a couple of blog posts on the Syntasso site where I map it more towards platform engineering concepts. And even if you're forced to use a tool, I believe you can still take some of those principles and practices to make your life and the future lives of yourself and your colleagues better. So ever the optimist, I think, still always good to learn, and it will help regardless of where you are in that migration or transformation journey.
Bought on a golf course.
Yeah.
The phrase that strikes fear into every person's life.
I'm still confused by what you said, Darren, a minute ago when you said they're starting to build a platform. Companies have been starting to build a platform for at least 30 years now.
In their mind, they're starting to build a platform because it's being sold to them. Yes, they've been building it all along. Yes, even the website for DevOpsParadox.com link down in the show notes, is a platform. It's a commit that goes to Netlify and off it goes. Have a nice day, right? That's all I need. I don't need more than that right now. Have I changed how I edit the podcast over the years? Yes. Did I do it all in one weekend? Oh, heck no. I tried a few things, found out what fit best. I think this is the key part that we've sort of walked around. What is best for me? This goes back to your 100% correct answer statement you said earlier. There will probably never, ever, ever, never, ever be a 100% correct answer globally, universally for this problem we're talking about. But within an organization, there may be. So all of Daniel's contact information is down in the episode description. Daniel, thanks for being with us today.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.